The unspoken truth: what my stepson did after fixing my car will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this gripping story, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support fuels more incredible tales like this. Now, join me as I unravel a heartfelt, unexpected journey, a broken car leading to a whirlwind of emotions, unspoken connections, and a life-changing moment that will keep you hooked until the very end. Let's begin. It was an ordinary autumn afternoon when the script of my life took an unexpected turn. I was stranded on the side of a quiet, desolate road, staring at the lifeless form of my car as frustration bubbled inside me. The stillness of the countryside pressed in, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the crisp breeze. It was in that quiet moment, surrounded by nothing but empty fields and solitude, that something within me stirred, a feeling long buried. Something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge in years. It was dangerous, electrifying, and undeniably alive. That sensation has lingered with me ever since. It's a bittersweet ache that refuses to fade. A reminder of choices I thought I had left behind. And now, as I recount this story, I feel it once again, woven into the very fabric of what I'm about to tell you. This is a story about the decisions we bury deep within ourselves, the emotions we dare not revisit, and how, sometimes, they resurface when we least expect it, carrying the weight of everything we once dared to feel. It all began on a serene late afternoon in early autumn. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. The air was crisp, carrying with it the earthy scent of fallen leaves. It was the kind of day that felt like a pause in time, a moment to reflect and breathe. I had decided to take the scenic route home from the small-town market, savoring the tranquility of the open road. The quiet drive offered a sense of escape, a brief reprieve from the endless demands of daily life. Adam, my husband, was away on another business trip, a common occurrence in our marriage. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to these absences, even finding a certain solace in the stillness they brought. After nearly 8 years together, our life had settled into a comfortable routine, one that often felt more like coexistence than connection. Yet, somewhere deep inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were slowly drifting apart. Like two ships sailing in the same direction but on parallel courses that never truly met. Lost in thought, I was jolted back to reality by a strange sound, a low, unsettling rumble emanating from the car's engine. I ignored it at first, hoping it was nothing more than a passing issue. But the noise grew louder, more insistent, until the car shuddered violently and came to an abrupt halt. Smoke curled from beneath the hood, a visible sign of trouble I couldn't dismiss. I stepped out of the car and surveyed my surroundings. There was nothing but endless fields stretching out in every direction. The road was eerily empty, devoid of other cars or signs of life. I reached for my phone, only to realize it was tucked away in my purse on the passenger seat. Even if I could call for help, it wouldn't change the reality of my situation. Adam had the other car, and he was hours away. Waiting for a tow truck seemed equally futile, given the remoteness of my location. A wave of frustration swept over me, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't the time to wallow in helplessness. I needed a solution, and I needed it quickly. That's when a familiar name surfaced in my mind: Joshua. My stepson. A mechanic who lived just a few miles away. Joshua had been a part of my life for years. Ever since Adam and I got married. I had watched him grow from an energetic teenager into a confident, capable young man. There had always been an unspoken warmth between us. A connection that felt natural yet oddly significant. But beneath that warmth was something I had never allowed myself to name, a fleeting, forbidden thought that I had buried deep within me, never to be revisited. As I stood there, stranded on the side of the road, I hesitated. A small, inexplicable pang of uncertainty caught me off guard. But I quickly dismissed it. This was Joshua, the boy I had seen grow into a man. And at that moment, he was my only hope. Little did I know, calling Joshua would set into motion a chain of events that would change everything. It didn't matter now. I needed him. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed his number. A tumultuous blend of nerves and relief coursing through me. Each ring felt like an eternity. The seconds stretching and twisting. Until I finally heard his familiar voice on the other end. Within 20 minutes, the low hum of a truck engine broke through the stillness around me. Joshua's weathered pickup came into view, dust swirling around its tires as it rolled to a stop behind me. He stepped out, his stride unhurried, his posture carrying that easy confidence I remembered so well. His blue work shirt, slightly rumpled, bore the marks of what must have been a long day in the garage. Yet there was no sign of fatigue in his face, only the warmth of a smile that softened his features and lit up his eyes with a glint of humor. "Mrs. Easton," he greeted, his voice carrying that teasing lilt that always seemed to disarm me. "What have we got here? Found yourself in a bit of trouble?" "Huh?" Despite the predicament, a laugh escaped my lips. It was light and unbidden, like the sudden breaking of a storm cloud. How long had it been since I'd heard that voice? Since I'd felt this unspoken ease? "Claire," I corrected, tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear in a futile attempt at composure. "And yes, it seems I've managed to get stranded in the middle of nowhere. I'm sorry to pull you away from work." Joshua's grin deepened, utterly unbothered. "No trouble at all," he assured me, walking with purpose toward my car. "I was just wrapping up for the day. Let's take a look and see what's going on." As he popped the hood, his hands moving with practiced precision, I stood back, watching. There was something mesmerizing about the way he worked, his calm confidence, the way his focus never wavered. Time seemed to blur as I found myself studying him in a way I hadn't in years. When had he changed? When had the boy I'd known grown into this man whose presence seemed to fill the space around him, shifting the air itself? It wasn't just a mechanic fixing a broken car, it was Joshua. The way he moved. The way he seemed to hold the world in balance without even realizing it. Memories and emotions I had long buried began to stir. Unbidden and unwelcome. Old feelings, ones I had convinced myself were locked away forever, crept back in like whispers on the wind. The tension in the air was subtle but undeniable. A current that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. As the golden light of the fading autumn sun bathed the scene, I found myself wondering, what happens when the past we've tried so hard to bury demands to be heard? What do we do when the choices we thought we left behind resurface with such clarity? "This is what I do best," Joshua remarked, his voice cutting through my thoughts as he leaned into the hood. "Besides, it's not every day I get an emergency call from my stepmother." The word hung in the air, a stark reminder of the lines neither of us could cross. Yet the way he said it, light-hearted, casual, felt like he was testing the boundary without ever stepping over it. His confidence was both reassuring and unsettling. And as I watched him work, I couldn't help but see him in a new light. His hands moved with a steady, unhurried grace, each motion deliberate, his concentration unwavering. He had always been capable. But now there was something more, an assurance. A quiet strength that hadn't been there before. I thought back to the days when I had first met him. When Adam and I had just married. Joshua had been a college student then. Polite and reserved. Little more than a peripheral figure in my life. But time had sculpted him into someone entirely different, someone who commanded attention in ways I wasn't prepared to confront. "Looks like a coolant leak," he announced, breaking the silence as he wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag. "Nothing too serious. But I'll need to tow it back to the shop. Should have it fixed by tomorrow." Relief washed over me. A sudden release of the tension that had been coiling in my chest since the car broke down. "Thank you," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Joshua." His smile in response was warm, genuine. But there was something else there too, something fleeting yet profound. It was a flicker in his gaze. A momentary shift that spoke of things neither of us dared to say aloud. And just as quickly, he looked away. His hands fidgeting with the rag as though to dispel the unspoken weight between us. "Tell you what," he said. His tone casual, though his eyes still held that quiet intensity. "Why don't you swing by the garage? I'll drive you home after I get this sorted." I hesitated, my heart quickening at the thought of more time in his company. "Are you sure? I don't want to trouble you any more than I already have." Joshua chuckled, his smile easy yet knowing. "Claire, it's no trouble at all. Besides," he added, with a teasing glint, "someone's got to make sure you get home in one piece." The autumn air seemed to hum with possibility as I nodded. An unexpected thrill sparking within me. Choices, buried and forgotten, were stirring once more. The mere thought of sitting in his truck, even for the briefest of rides, sent an inexplicable flutter through my chest, a feeling that was as unsettling as it was strangely comforting. I could feel the beginnings of a nervous energy building inside me. A tension I couldn't quite place. My heart, traitorous and unbidden, seemed to leap at the idea. But I forced myself to remain composed, schooling my expression into one of casual indifference. "If it's not too much trouble," I said, striving to keep my tone light, though the words felt heavier than they should have. "It's no trouble at all," Joshua replied, his voice steady, carrying with it a kind of warmth that I wasn't sure how to interpret. His faint smile lingered for a moment before softening into something more genuine, more inviting. "Let's sort this car out first, and then I'll make sure you get home safe and sound." The following afternoon, I found myself standing in the threshold of Joshua's garage. The familiar scent of oil, metal, and rubber enveloped me like an old memory. The rhythmic hum of machinery filled the space, mingling with the metallic clinks and clatters of tools in motion. It was a symphony of purpose, one that spoke of years of practice and dedication. Joshua was bent over the engine of my car, his hands deft and sure as he worked with an almost meditative precision. I lingered by the doorway, hesitant to interrupt but unable to look away. There was a quiet intensity in the way he moved, a natural ease that seemed to anchor the world around him. I had seen him work countless times before, but today felt different. There was a weight in the air that I couldn't ignore, a pull that felt both unsettling and undeniable. As I watched him, an unfamiliar sensation stirred within me, admiration. Yes, but layered with something deeper. something unspoken that made my pulse quicken. He looked up as I approached, his expression softening as our eyes met. For a moment, it felt as if the rest of the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of us in the golden glow of the late afternoon light streaming through the open garage doors. Setting his tools aside, he wiped his hands on a grease-streaked cloth and straightened, his gaze lingering on mine just a beat longer than necessary. "There you are," he said, his voice warm, though it carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something unspoken yet unmistakable. "The car's nearly done. You'll be back on the road in no time." "Thank you, Joshua," I replied, my smile wavering under the weight of my own emotions. I wanted the words to sound casual, light-hearted, but they came out quieter, softer. "I didn't mean for you to go to so much trouble. I feel guilty." He shrugged, his lips curving into that familiar, easy smile. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, they seemed to hold something more, a depth that both comforted and unsettled me. "Your family, Vivian," he said simply, his tone steady but layered with meaning. "It's the least I can do." The words hung in the air between us, unspoken threads weaving a connection I wasn't sure I was ready to acknowledge. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stood there, watching him as he turned back to the car, his movements purposeful yet unhurried. Something had shifted, an almost imperceptible change, but one I couldn't ignore. Joshua wasn't the same boy I had known all those years ago, just as I wasn't the same woman who had first walked into his life. Time had shaped us both, carving out the people we had become. And yet, in this moment, I felt as if the barriers we had built around ourselves were beginning to crumble. As the last of the repairs were completed, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garage floor. We found ourselves drawn into conversation, the kind that meandered effortlessly from one topic to the next, as though we had all the time in the world. Each word, each shared memory, felt like a small piece of myself being unearthed. Pieces I hadn't realized I had buried beneath years of routine and responsibility. I told him about my youth, dreams I had once chased with abandon, only to let them slip away as life demanded more of me. I spoke of regrets I had long since tucked into the corners of my heart, of the joys and sorrows that had shaped me into the woman I was today. And as I spoke, he listened, not with polite interest, but with an attentiveness that felt profound. His gaze never wavered, his eyes warm and steady, as though he could see through every word to the heart of who I was. In that moment, I felt seen, not as someone's wife, someone's stepmother, but as Vivian, a woman with her own story, her own desires, her own quiet yearning to rediscover the parts of herself she had long since forgotten. The weight of it all, the unspoken connection, the shared understanding, settled over me like a second skin. The lines between us were blurring, and though I knew I was treading dangerous ground, I couldn't bring myself to step back. Joshua's presence was a steady flame, one that warmed me even as it threatened to consume me. And as the light in the garage grew dimmer, I realized with a quiet certainty that something between us had changed. Something that could not, would not, be undone. As the afternoon waned, the sky outside transformed into a canvas of deep grays, the ominous clouds weaving a foreboding tapestry across the horizon. The first delicate drops of rain began their descent, soft at first, like a gentle whisper, before settling into a rhythmic, soothing cadence. I turned my gaze toward the door, watching as the storm outside seemed to gather strength. Its presence both unsettling and oddly comforting. Joshua followed my line of sight, his lips curling into a faint smile. A gesture so subtle yet filled with an unspoken understanding. "Looks like we're in for some weather," he remarked, his voice low, carrying a warmth that contrasted with the cold droplets now streaking the windows. I nodded in agreement. But my thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by a storm far more turbulent than the one unfolding outside. The silence between us lengthened, punctuated only by the steady drumming of rain against the roof. In that suspended moment, it felt as if time itself had paused. The past and future dissolved into irrelevance, leaving only the present, a fragile, fleeting connection between the two of us, caught in the eye of an emotional tempest that mirrored the one in the skies. Joshua took a step closer, his movements deliberate yet hesitant, as though he were crossing a boundary neither of us fully understood. His hand rose gently, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The brief contact sent a shiver coursing through me, a ripple of electricity that I couldn't ignore. His touch, so tender and unassuming, seemed to pierce through the carefully constructed walls I had spent years fortifying. I leaned toward him, the pull between us undeniable, magnetic, and irresistible. The invisible lines that had always defined our relationship, the boundaries we had both respected without question, blurred in an instant. Those lines, once so steadfast, melted into irrelevance, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth of what was unfolding. Joshua's presence was overwhelming, his closeness a force I couldn't deny. His breath mingled with mine, warm and steady, and when his lips finally brushed against mine, it was barely more than a whisper of contact. Yet, that whisper carried a storm of emotion, a tidal wave of longing that had been buried for too long. The kiss deepened, becoming a dance of unspoken confessions, of desires that had simmered beneath the surface for years. It was tender, yes, but also desperate, an expression of all the things neither of us had been brave enough to voice. When the kiss finally broke, the air between us felt charged, electric. We stepped back, reluctant yet needing space to process the moment that had irrevocably changed everything. My heart raced, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and clarity. What had we just done? And why? Despite knowing it shouldn't have happened, did it feel so achingly right? The days that followed blurred into a strange mix of routine and upheaval. On the surface, life resumed its predictable rhythms. Adam returned from his business trip, his composed demeanor and steady presence grounding the household. Yet beneath that veneer of normalcy, a quiet revolution stirred within me. The kiss had awakened something raw, terrifying, and thrilling in equal measure. No matter how hard I tried to bury it, the memory refused to fade, a constant hum at the edges of my consciousness. I began finding reasons, no excuses, to see Joshua. The car, which had been running flawlessly since his last repair, suddenly seemed to need constant attention. Each time I drove to his garage, my heart raced, anticipation and guilt warring within me. The sight of his truck parked outside filled me with an irrational sense of relief, a confirmation that he was there, waiting. He greeted me with that same easy smile, his voice steady and unassuming. But his eyes, they betrayed him. In their depths, I saw a reflection of my own turmoil, a shared understanding neither of us dared to articulate. Our interactions became a series of silent conversations, each glance laden with meaning, Each touch a confession we couldn't bring ourselves to utter aloud. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with a tension neither of us seemed willing, or able, to dispel. Yet every time I left the garage, a sense of inevitability hung over me. We were standing on the precipice of something neither of us knew how to stop. Yet neither of us wanted to. One evening, as rain once again pattered against the windows, I found myself sitting with Joshua in the quiet warmth of his office. The storm outside mirrored the one inside me, a churning mix of desire, guilt, and a nameless longing that defied explanation. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The ticking of the clock filled the room, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, Joshua broke the silence, his voice low and measured. "I get it," he said, his words carrying a weight that settled heavily in the space between us. "Sometimes it feels like you're standing on the edge of something, waiting for it to happen." I looked at him, startled by how perfectly his words captured the turmoil within me. It was as though he had peered into the depths of my soul and named the very thing I had been unable to define. The understanding in his eyes, the quiet acceptance of my unspoken admission, was both a comfort and a challenge. It dared me to confront the truth I had been avoiding, that what was happening between us wasn't just a fleeting moment but the beginning of something far more profound, far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. And yet, as I sat there, enveloped in the quiet storm of his presence, I couldn't help but wonder if some storms were meant to be weathered, not avoided. It wasn't just about him or me anymore. It was about something far larger. Something unspoken but deeply felt, something that had been missing from my life for longer than I cared to admit. For years, I had been tethered to the roles expected of me: a wife, a mother, a stepmother. I had woven my identity into these obligations so tightly that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist, to feel alive outside the confines of those labels. And now, here he was, a force I hadn't anticipated, pulling me back toward something raw and real, a version of myself I thought I had lost. The room felt heavier with every passing second, the air between us electric, thrumming with a tension that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. The silence wasn't just silence, it was a living, breathing thing, thick and tangible, pressing down on us as if daring us to acknowledge it. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, I found myself leaning forward ever so slightly. It was as though some invisible thread tied us together, drawing me closer to him, to the magnetic pull I could no longer deny. Joshua's eyes dropped to my lips, and in that instant, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. A shiver coursed through me, half anticipation, half regret. This was dangerous. I knew it in every fiber of my being. But even with that knowledge, stopping felt impossible. As though the path had already been carved out beneath our feet and we were powerless to change its course. The space between us narrowed, the inevitable pulling us closer with each breath. I could feel the warmth of his breath brushing against my skin, steady yet intoxicating. And then, with a pause so slight it barely registered, he closed the distance. His lips met mine in a kiss that was tentative at first, testing the waters, as though we were both afraid of what we might find. But fear gave way to something deeper, something that had been simmering for far too long. The kiss deepened, his touch igniting every nerve ending, leaving me breathless and overwhelmed. The world outside disappeared. There were no walls, no storms, no rules, just him and me, locked in this moment that was equal parts passion and chaos. My thoughts scattered. My mind unable to grasp the enormity of what was happening. There was only sensation, the heat of his body close to mine. The intensity of his lips on mine. The tidal wave of desire threatening to drown us both. Every rational part of me screamed to pull away. To stop this before we fell further into something we couldn't undo. But there was another part of me, a quiet, unyielding voice, that wanted this more than anything else. A part of me that had been dormant for so long it felt like waking up after years of sleep. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began. Both of us pulling back as if some invisible force had severed the connection. Our breaths mingled in the charged air between us. Ragged and uneven. For a long moment. Neither of us moved. And the silence that followed was deafening. The storm outside had calmed. But the tempest raging inside me was anything but. I looked at him. My emotions laid bare. My heart a chaotic whirlwind of guilt, longing, and confusion. Joshua's gaze locked onto mine. His eyes searching. Pleading for something, an answer. An excuse. A way to make sense of what had just happened. But all he would find in my expression was the same raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored his own. I shouldn't have done that, he said finally. His voice hoarse and tinged with regret. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The tension in his posture palpable. It was as though he was physically restraining himself. Fighting the urge to reach for me again. Joshua. I began. My voice faltering as a wave of emotion threatened to overwhelm me. You don't have to apologize, he interrupted. His words soft but firm. I stood. Moving toward the window. Needing to put space between us. To regain some semblance of clarity. The rain had slowed. Droplets still clinging to the glass. Mirroring the tears threatening to spill from my eyes. We've crossed a line we can't uncross. I said quietly. My voice trembling with the weight of the truth. There was a long pause before he spoke again. His tone subdued. I don't know what to do with this, he admitted. His vulnerability cutting through me like a blade. I don't know where to go from here. I turned to face him. My heart pounding painfully in my chest. Neither do I whispered. Though the words felt inadequate. A hollow echo of the turmoil inside me. The longer we stood here, suspended in this impossible moment, the more entangled we became in the web we had spun. Every glance, every word, every unspoken thought pulled us deeper into something neither of us knew how to navigate. The silence stretched on. Heavy and oppressive. Finally, Joshua rose. His movements slow and deliberate. As if every step away from me was a battle. I should go, he said. His voice almost a whisper now. You need time to think. I nodded. Though my heart screamed at me to stop him. To say something. To find a way to fix this mess we had created. But there was nothing simple about this. There were consequences to what we had done. And the weight of those consequences hung between us like a shadow. He walked to the door. Hesitating for a moment before turning back to face me. His expression was pained. His eyes filled with a mix of longing and resignation. Vivian, he said softly. His voice laden with emotion. I care about you. I don't want to make this harder than it already is. And with that, he was gone. Leaving me alone with the storm still raging inside me. And the undeniable truth that nothing would ever be the same again. With that, he left. Leaving me standing in the dim light of the living room. The rain outside had dwindled to a faint memory. its once insistent patter replaced by a heavy stillness that seeped into the room. The air between us remained thick, unresolved, carrying the weight of unspoken words and fractured promises. I stood there, my chest tight with an ache that seemed to reach into my very core, realizing with painful clarity that I didn't know what would come next. Whatever it was, we had already crossed a threshold, and nothing would ever be the same. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my ears as if echoing the turmoil inside me. Adam's gesture, though simple and unassuming, carried a tenderness that felt like a lifeline. But to me, it also felt like a burden, a reminder of the chasm between what was and what could never be. He was trying, reaching out to bridge the gap between us. But how could I welcome it fully when my heart and thoughts were entangled elsewhere? Drawing a breath, I forced a smile and turned to face him, masking the storm that raged beneath the surface. "That's a nice surprise," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We could all use more time together." My words felt hollow, a polite acknowledgement more than a heartfelt truth. Adam nodded, his hand lingering on my shoulder in a gesture meant to comfort but which only deepened my guilt. He had no idea what lay beneath the surface, and I loathed myself for keeping it hidden. The guilt churned in my stomach, twisting into knots that made me feel like a stranger in my own skin. "I thought," he began, his voice soft and hopeful, "we could take a short trip. Just the two of us. Get away from everything for a bit. Reconnect." His suggestion was kind, thoughtful, and part of me ached to say yes. To dive back into the life we had painstakingly built together. I wanted to erase the guilt, the longing, the forbidden desire that tugged at me like an undertow. But even as his words lingered, another image surfaced unbidden: Joshua. His eyes, intense and searching, his touch, electric and grounding all at once. The way I had come alive in his presence, as though rediscovering a part of myself that had long been buried. "I'd love that," I said, my voice tight, betraying none of the chaos within. But the truth burned in my throat, an ache I couldn't swallow. Part of me longed for the escape Adam offered. Yet another part felt trapped, ensnared in a web of deceit I had spun myself. Adam's smile softened as he kissed the top of my head. A tender, unassuming gesture that only magnified the war within me. He had no idea of the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. No inkling of the choices I had made. Choices that had already altered the course of our lives. "Good," he said warmly. "We'll figure out the details soon." As he left the room, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My chest felt heavy, my thoughts muddled with emotions too tangled to unravel. I had not only betrayed Adam's trust, I had betrayed myself, allowing feelings I should have resisted to take root. And now, the only way forward seemed to be letting everything unravel. But could I walk away from Joshua? Could I truly erase what we had shared? The undeniable connection that had shifted something fundamental within me. His presence had awakened a hunger I didn't even know I carried. A longing that felt more real than anything I had experienced in years. The pull between us was inescapable. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't sever the invisible thread that bound us. As the evening wore on, I busied myself with mundane tasks, trying to outrun my own thoughts. I scrubbed the counters, folded laundry, rearranged the bookshelf, anything to distract myself. But Joshua's presence lingered like a shadow, haunting every corner of my mind. The memory of his touch, The way he looked at me as if seeing parts of me no one else could. Refused to fade. When Adam returned to the kitchen to discuss plans for the weeks ahead, I nodded and smiled, responding to his words on autopilot. But my mind was elsewhere. I was with Joshua, hearing his voice, feeling his hands, reliving moments that had seared themselves into my very being. How had I allowed myself to drift so far from the life I once cherished? Later that evening, I excused myself under the pretense of fatigue and retreated to our bedroom. But sleep remained elusive. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts spiraled. The life I had built with Adam, a life of stability, love, and shared history, was slipping through my fingers. And I couldn't decide if I was clinging to it out of habit or fear of what letting go would mean. And then there was Joshua. He had come into my life like a storm, sweeping me into his orbit with a force I hadn't anticipated. Even now, he seemed to inhabit every thought, every breath, a constant presence I couldn't escape. The choice I faced felt insurmountable. A crossroads where no path seemed unscathed. The weight of both worlds pressed down on me, demanding a decision I wasn't ready to make. I wanted to believe there was a way to reconcile it all. To love both men in different ways. To exist in two realities without consequence. But deep down, I knew the truth: something had to give. Someone would be hurt. And no matter which path I chose, I risked losing a part of myself. As the hours stretched on and the night deepened, the storm within me raged, relentless and unyielding. I lay there, caught between the life I had known and the life I had glimpsed, each one pulling at me with equal force. The words that had been spoken earlier hung in the air. An unspoken question. An unrelenting reminder that I could not remain in this liminal space forever. Eventually, I would have to decide, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to make the choice. My heart jolted, an almost audible thud reverberating in my chest, and my throat tightened as though invisible hands were squeezing it shut. I fought to keep my composure, forcing my lips into a smile that felt as fragile as porcelain. It was a facade, a mask too thin to hide the storm roiling beneath my skin. "Clara," I began, my voice betraying me with a faint tremor. "What are you talking about?" I tried to sound casual, unaffected, but the quiver was there, and I knew she had noticed. Her eyes stayed on me, unblinking, steady. I could feel her gaze bearing down on me, a weight that made the room seem smaller. The stillness between us was thick, charged with unspoken tension. Then, she smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. There was something new in her expression, something sharp and unnerving, as though she had uncovered a secret and was deciding what to do with it. "I don't know, Claire," she said softly, her tone measured, her head tilting as if she were inspecting a puzzle piece. She leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming lightly against its armrest. "But you've been different lately." Adams noticed, too. My stomach lurched. Clara wasn't one to throw out careless observations. She was perceptive. Too perceptive. With a knack for seeing the things people didn't want to show. How could she have picked up on anything? I had been so careful, or at least, I thought I had. Different? That's ridiculous, I replied, laughing lightly. But the sound rang hollow in my ears. I could feel the perspiration beginning to form on my palms, my heart galloping in my chest. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, studying me. She wasn't convinced. She had always been the one to sit quietly in the corner. Watching. Analyzing. Storing information away until it mattered. And now. Her focus was on me. "I've just been stressed," I said quickly. Before she could press further. "You know how Adam's schedule has been. He's so busy. And I guess it's just been a lot for me." My voice faltered at the end, betraying the lie for what it was. She didn't respond right away, instead letting the silence settle between us like a smothering blanket. Finally, she shrugged, her expression unreadable. "If you say so," she murmured, though there was an edge to her tone that made it clear she wasn't letting this go. She shifted the conversation to lighter topics, weather, family gossip, but I could feel the tension clinging to us. It lingered like the smell of smoke after a fire. Impossible to ignore. Her words, her implication, had shaken something loose in me. A realization that the fragile threads I had been relying on to hold my secret together were beginning to fray. The rest of her visit blurred past in meaningless chatter. But I wasn't present. My mind was trapped in an endless loop of dread. Analyzing every glance. Every nuance of her words. And what they might mean. I couldn't afford for Clara. Or anyone. To suspect the truth. And yet. No matter how much I fought against it. I couldn't escape the pull of Joshua. His name alone was enough to send my thoughts spiraling into dangerous territory. The memory of his touch. His voice. The way he had awakened something inside me that I hadn't felt in years, it was intoxicating. Irresistible. It was also everything I should have been running from. When Clara finally left. She lingered in the doorway. Her smile warm but her eyes piercing. I returned the gesture. But the moment the door clicked shut behind her, I felt the air leave my lungs. The house seemed too quiet. Too empty. The walls pressing in around me. Adam would be home soon. I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway and hurried to compose myself. I busied my hands with a dish towel, wiping aimlessly at the counter as if the motion could scrub away the guilt etched into my skin. When he walked in, his familiar smile lit up the room. And for a fleeting moment, I felt the weight lift. He kissed my cheek. His presence steady and grounding. But it only deepened the ache in my chest. The guilt burned hotter in his kindness. And I couldn't meet his eyes for too long. Afraid of what he might see. Dinner was quiet. Adam talked about his day. Oblivious to my distracted nods and murmurs of agreement. My mind was far away. Circling back to Clara's words. Her pointed gaze. How much had she noticed? How much did she suspect? Later that night, as Adam slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, but my thoughts were blindingly vivid, swirling with fears I couldn't silence. I reached for his hand, needing the comfort of his warmth. But even that felt hollow. The questions haunted me. What would happen if the truth came out? Could I face the destruction it would bring to my life? To Adam's? To everything we had built together? And worst of all, could I ever let go of Joshua? The answers eluded me. A cruel reminder of the tangled web I had spun. Each passing day brought the inevitable closer. And I knew, deep down, that when the truth surfaced, there would be no escaping its consequences. Moments of my life. The ones I had overlooked for so long, the hum of the coffee maker in the morning. The soft rustle of Adam's newspaper. The warmth of the sun streaming through the kitchen window. Yet, every so often, A wave of grief would wash over me, threatening to pull me under. I missed Joshua with a raw ache that seemed to have taken root in my very soul. Our final conversation played on a loop in my mind. The way his voice broke when he told me he loved me. The pain in his eyes as he let me go. I wondered if he felt the same emptiness that I did. If he woke in the middle of the night and reached for a presence that wasn't there. But I had chosen my path. And I had to honor it. Walking away from Joshua had felt like cutting off a part of myself. But it was a sacrifice I had to make to rebuild the life I had promised to Adam. Adam never asked about the sadness that lingered in my eyes or the quiet moments when I seemed lost in thought. Perhaps he noticed the shift. But he chose not to confront it. Instead, he offered small gestures of kindness that felt like olive branches, bringing me my favorite tea without asking. Suggesting a weekend getaway to the mountains. Even picking up the book I had mentioned wanting to read. His attempts to reconnect were tentative but genuine. And I clung to them like a lifeline. Still, there were nights when the silence between us felt insurmountable. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my choices pressing down on me. The life I had built with Adam was steady, predictable, safe. But it was also a life that had dulled the edges of who I once was. I had chosen it because it was the right thing to do. The responsible thing. But in my quietest moments, I wondered if it was enough. Joshua's absence was a shadow that followed me. A constant reminder of the road not taken. I thought about the passion we had shared. The way his presence had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. It was a kind of love that burned brightly, fiercely, but perhaps too dangerously to sustain. And yet, even knowing that, I missed him. I missed his laugh, his touch, the way he saw me in a way no one else ever had. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes while Adam read in the living room, a sudden realization struck me. Love was not meant to be simple or easy. It was messy, complicated, and often painful. But it was also transformative. My love for Joshua had taught me things about myself I might never have learned otherwise: my capacity for vulnerability, my strength in the face of heartbreak, and my ability to make a choice even when every fiber of my being wanted to run away from it. In the weeks that followed, I found myself slowly letting go of the grief and guilt that had consumed me. I began to focus on the things that brought me peace: the soft melody of rain against the windows, the quiet satisfaction of finishing a good book, the feeling of Adam's hand in mine during our evening walks. They were small, quiet joys, but they were mine, and I held on to them tightly. I never saw Joshua again, though I often wondered where life had taken him. I hoped he had found the happiness that had eluded us, that he had discovered a path that brought him peace. And as for me, I realized that the choice I had made was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter. It was a chapter filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. Because in the end, life is not about the paths we didn't take, but about the ones we choose to walk. And as I stood at the crossroads of my two lives, I understood that the only way forward was to keep moving, one step at a time, carrying the lessons of love, loss, and resilience with me. And somehow, in that quiet acceptance, I found a measure of peace. The things that defined my life with Adam were small but profound: the way his laughter echoed through the house, bringing it to life, the quiet warmth of his presence by my side, grounding me in moments of uncertainty, and the unwavering steadiness of his love, which wrapped around me like a blanket on a cold night. He didn't know the full weight of my past, what I had done, what I had lost, but in a way, that made him my safe harbor. For all his flaws and imperfections, Adam had been the anchor I desperately needed. The one constant in a world that often felt unpredictable and fragile. There were quiet nights, though, when the weight of the evening pressed heavily against me, and the silence became a mirror reflecting all I tried to bury. In those moments, Joshua's memory would surface, unbidden and vivid. I could feel the ghost of his touch, a sensation so real it left me breathless. His gaze, intense and all-consuming, would linger in my mind like a half-forgotten melody. Joshua had seen me, truly seen me, in a way I hadn't realized I yearned for until it was gone. And yet, that very clarity came with an ache so profound it felt like a wound that would never fully heal. Many nights, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in a fog of what-ifs. What if I had stayed? What if I had chosen a different path? The questions were relentless, echoing in the quiet as I wrestled with the weight of my decisions. The ache of that loss was a constant companion, a shadow that followed me even into the moments I cherished most. It was neither loud nor overbearing, but it was always there. A quiet reminder of the life I didn't choose. But I learned to live with it. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to reconcile the pieces of myself, the part that had known a love so raw, so unspoken it felt like a secret carved into my soul, and the part of me that had chosen stability, the familiar, the life I had returned to. There were no tidy answers, no perfect resolutions. It was a messy, painful process of rediscovery, of figuring out who I was in the aftermath of choices that left scars on my heart. At times, doubt crept in like an unwelcome visitor. Had I made the right choice? Could I have stayed with Joshua and built something new? Something that defied the odds? Could love have been enough to navigate the chaos and complexity of it all? Those questions haunted me, lingering at the edges of my mind like a storm waiting to break. But then, I would find myself in the quiet moments with Adam, his hand brushing against mine, his steady voice reminding me that I was loved. He had a way of making me feel safe, even when I doubted myself. His love wasn't perfect, it was flawed and human. But it was real. It was enough to remind me why I had chosen him. Why I had decided to build a life rooted in the kind of love that wasn't flashy or intense but enduring and kind. The choice I had made was mine alone. And while it came with loss, it also brought clarity, strength, and a deeper sense of purpose. I didn't regret the love I had shared with Joshua. That chapter of my life was a part of me, woven into the fabric of who I was. But through the pain and the doubt, I had discovered something invaluable: the power of living authentically, of embracing both the beauty and the consequences of my choices. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, it rarely does, but it became mine. Each day was a step forward, a chance to grow into the person I was becoming. That journey, shaped by love, loss, and resilience, was enough. I didn't need all the answers, I just needed the courage to keep moving. To let the lessons of my past guide me without defining me. As the story concludes, we're left with one question: what have you learned? Life is a series of choices, some easy, others incredibly difficult. Claire's journey teaches us about love, responsibility, and the courage to embrace authenticity, no matter how painful it might be. Now, I want to hear from you. Share in the comments one lesson you'll take away from this story and how it might shape your future decisions. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support inspires me to create more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.